You're listening to CRV's Better Heard podcast. Join us as we talk to CRV experts, industry leaders and farmers about hot topics and issues affecting herd improvement in New Zealand's dairy industry today.
Thanks for joining us as we kick off the third series of CRV's Better Heard podcast. I'm Mitchell Koot, CRV's Genetic Product Manager for the New Zealand market, and today we're talking facial eczema. It's a devastating disease that costs New Zealand dairy farmers hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost milk production each year. Not only is it costly in dollar terms, but it can also have severe implications for animal health. Joining me today is CRV Head Geneticist Phil Beatson, and we welcome VetEnt Vet and Research Head Emma Cuttance. Thanks for joining Emma and Phil. So Emma, can you tell us a bit more about facial eczema? What causes it and what are the symptoms?
Sure. A lot of people have been around this information for a wee while, I guess, but in a nutshell, facial eczema is a liver disease in ruminants. And that happens because they're eating grass, and in the dead matter of the grass, so the dead and dying leaf, there's a fungus that grows when it gets nice and warm and humid. And that fungus, called Pithomyces shatarum, produces spores. When it gets really humid, the spores just go nuts. So there are spores everywhere, and in those spores is a toxin called sporidesmin. So what happens is any ruminant, cow, sheep, deer, they eat this toxin. And when it gets into the rumen, it undergoes a chemical reaction. And so what happens is it breaks some of the bonds that it has, and it changes its form. And then what happens is it doesn't like being in that form, so it changes back again. And then it changes back, and then it changes back, right? So you've got this sporidesmin molecule that's super unstable that keeps flicking from form to form to form. And the process of doing that is that it flicks off what we call these supercharged oxygen molecules. They're called free radicals, and they're around, like people talk about free radicals all the time, because they talk about stuff like, oh, you've got to drink red wine because it absorbs free radicals, and you've got to eat dark chocolate because it absorbs free radicals. And these things sound bonkers, but they are totally real. And what these things do is they get into the bloodstream and they go straight to the liver and they damage the liver. Right? So it's actually not the toxin that does the damage to the animals. It is the reaction that the toxin undergoes. So it goes along and it damages the liver, and it really focuses on the bile ducts of the liver. And they have a really important job in an animal because they're getting rid of toxic stuff that they're eating, right? So, and I'm not talking about crazy chemicals. We're talking about just natural reactions that go along when an animal eats, right? So when they eat grass, for example, grass is green because of the chlorophyll, and that chlorophyll breaks down and they get rid of those byproducts through the liver and through the bile ducts. So when these free radicals come along and smash out the liver and smash out the bile ducts, they can't get rid of all this stuff anymore. So it builds up in their system, and it does a number of different things. One of them, and probably the most important thing, is that it affects production. It stops them producing milk. It stops them growing as well. And in some animals, and I do want to emphasize here that just some, they'll show clinical signs of disease, right? So that's with us peeling skin and they get irritable and stuff like that. So that's essentially what it is. But I think the key thing when we're talking about facial eczema, and I say this every time that I speak, facial eczema is a stupid name. It's not about eczema. It's not about the face. It is a liver disease. And the liver disease in some animals causes eczema-type symptoms. But in most animals, it doesn't. It just goes under the radar, smashing production and causing problems to the animals that are eating this toxin.
So how prevalent is facial eczema in New Zealand? And are some regions more affected than others?
So facial eczema is very prevalent in New Zealand, but that prevalence changes depending on the year. So some years, facial eczema is absolutely everywhere. It's in the entire North Island. It's in the top of the South Island. Sometimes it's in the west coast of the South Island. And sometimes it's down as far as Canterbury, right? So some years are horrific. And then you get other years where it's just sort of simmering along in some of the key regions, So like one year you might find Taranaki is just getting smashed by eczema, but the Waikato isn't. Or, sometimes it might be Bay of Plenty. So it is very prevalent, but that prevalence changes depending on the season, which of course is logical because it's all depending on the weather. So if you have warm days, humidity in some regions and not others, you'll get more eczema around. In terms of the damage, it's really tricky because it changes year to year. But when we looked at this as a research project in 2013, when we were blood sampling cattle from about 105 different farms across the North Island, we found a third of those farms had evidence of significant liver damage. None of them had clinical signs. So they were totally unaware. And this wasn't like one of those crazy facial eczema years. Like, sometimes you get years where you got like, my God, every cow has facial eczema. It's really, really bad. The year that we were doing this study, there wasn't really a lot going on. There was not a lot going on with spore counts, yet a third of farms still had evidence of eczema damage in their cattle. So it's very prevalent. And the freaky thing about it is that it's going to get worse, because when you've got rising temperatures and this constant change of weather, this thing is just continuing to spread throughout New Zealand, and you get people, Otago, Southland, they think they're safe, but you wait. A decade's time, they won't be. It is just getting that bad.
You mentioned in that study that a lot of the farmers had it. Do some farmers have it without realising? They don't actually know that they've got it without the testing?
I would honestly is close to say that almost all farmers have it without realising it, right? So when you're looking at eczema, about 5% of animals show clinical signs of eczema. First of all, most of them don't show the signs. So they have liver damage and they don't show it. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, is it just mild liver damage? No, it's not. Gosh, the number of blood samples I've taken in my research career, it must be hundreds of thousands now. You get blood results that are like, oh my God, I didn't even know they could go that high, showing liver damage, and they're not showing clinical signs. So most farmers don't know. And I guess the second thing is most farmers, they might get one or two clinical signs, but they are not understanding the significance of that. So if you've got a herd and you're like, oh, yeah, I've got one or two with red teats, or I've got one or two that seems a bit irritable, you can assume that you've probably got 50 to 100 animals in that herd with liver damage that are just not showing it. So it is a severely underdiagnosed disease.
So with that, how much of a concern is it to the New Zealand dairy industry and the impact you touched on economically, but also animal welfare there? How much concern do you see it being?
I see it as a huge concern. And you've really touched on the two areas where it's a concern. The first is in lost milk production. So what we've found is that the milk production losses is quite substantial. We were finding that animals, when we've just recently done research in the past couple of years, that animals were losing milk production even if they would just slightly increase above the reference range for liver damage, right? So we measure liver damage using an enzyme called GGT, and it has like a normal level in the cow, right? So it might be about up to 40 units. Now, any rise above that reference level, cows start dropping in milk production. And it just gets worse and worse and worse the higher that they get. And so the potential for production loss is huge, but that's just one side of it. Because if they start getting lower production, what tends to happen is they get dried off early. So you've got that loss of, in that respect. Then you've got things like mortality and deaths that come along. And although that's not massive, the animal health issues and the deaths, what we found wasn't a massive driver. The production certainly was. And then you've got the second issue, which is welfare, which certainly in my mind is the most important. And, we've got to remember there's a lot of pressure on the dairy industry now, having that social license to farm. we've got pressure from New Zealanders for starters, but you've got pressure of overseas markets. We have to be showing that we are farming to a high level of welfare. And so when you've got, certainly with clinical facial eczema, we can't have that sort of stuff. It's terrible for the animal, for starters, incredibly painful. Awful to see. Anyone that's had it, that's listening to this podcast, will just know how excruciatingly awful it is to see it. It affects the farmers as much as anything as well. They're just devastated by it. So, there's that side, but it's affecting the animals as well, and affecting, I guess, our image to overseas and within New Zealand. So it's huge. And there's actually just a research paper that's just about to come out that was designed to say, when animals get eczema, are they feeling pain? It's so hard to measure that in a cow, right? Because they don't show pain signals being a prey animal. So, what we did with this was mixed in with ag research, is we were testing animals that had a lot of liver damage for other things that might suggest that they are in pain. And it was indicating that actually, there was a bit of a correlation between when that enzyme went up, that shows that there's liver damage, and these pain indicators. So there's definitely something going on there for the animal, and not just the clinical signs, that liver damage is causing other stuff going on with them as well.
And the liver damage, is that permanent for the animal? Are the effects on the animal permanent for its lifetime?
It's such a good question. I get asked it a lot, and I think it largely depends on how much damage there is. So if you just get sort of a little bit of damage, the liver regenerates really beautifully. They can overcome it and they do fine. If they get a lot of damage, what tends to happen is that fibrous tissue cells start taking over the liver cells. So you get this just gnarly mess of a liver. And animals can actually regrow their liver. We've done studies where we were looking at livers in the meat processing plants. And I got sent some photos from these guys actually showing sort of a messed up, gnarly little liver that obviously has been smashed by eczema, and a new liver grew off the side. So it is possible. But the question is that new liver tissue and that sort of reduced function that they've got affecting them? And I can say absolutely it must be, because we've found that, if they get eczema in the season that they're milking, right, it drops their milk production, absolutely. But what we've also found in research is that if they don't get it the next year, right, so let's say you can go and you confirm, no, they did not get liver damage the next year, they still have lowered milk production. So even if their liver is regenerating, I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that it's just not up to the play to be able to function like that original liver. And so it's affecting their production still. I think that's really important when we've got a lot of pressure on the dairy cow to produce the big, pumping out lots of milk. They have to be in pretty good nick. Their liver has to be working pretty awesome to be able to achieve that. So any sort of decline is going to affect them.
So with the effects of facial eczema being very large, how are farmers currently managing facial eczema in their herds? And do you think New Zealand dairy farmers are doing enough?
Well, it's almost impossible to answer how they're doing. And the reason why it's impossible to answer is that because you don't see the signs of facial eczema very well, you can't really tell how well people are managing it unless you're doing things like blood tests. There are not enough farmers checking to see if their management program is working. So my gut feeling, because we're often doing trial work every year, is that there are pockets of farmers that do very well, that they've listened to all the advice, they've taken stuff on board. We've got farmers all over the country that have changed their entire management system to better combat facial eczema. So there are definitely pockets that huge improvements have been made. But the gutting thing is that every year we're usually involved with research where our job is to find herds that have facial eczema damage, right? So we can get all the liver damage. And it's so easy to do. And that's what's so gutting about it, is every year when I send out a message out to the country and all the veterinarians around the country saying, hey, look, if you've got herds that you're aware of that are having big breakdowns in facial eczema management, let me know. And every year I am inundated with emails of herds that are having facial eczema breakdowns. So to answer your question, are farmers doing enough? No. Farmers are not doing enough. There is still too much of this stuff going on. There's still too much guesswork, too many mistakes. We've got to do more. We really do.
Do you think that's because of the costs involved to do the testing and management, or just a lack of understanding of the impacts of the disease?
I think that it's a bit of both. So I think that a lot of people don't test because they don't see it. And when you don't see something, you don't think you've got a problem. So it's very easy to fall under the radar. So then if you can get over the hurdle of testing, yes, testing has some expense to it, but Jesus, it's nothing relative to the loss that you get with eczema. So I think that it probably just comes back to what you don't see, you think you don't have. And unless we start searching for it and actually looking, people are going to still think that they're getting away with poor facial eczema management practices. So there's lots of work to do on the monitoring side of things.
So we know zinc is a management tool to combat facial eczema. How effective is zinc at managing facial eczema?
Zinc is good at managing facial eczema if, and I'm emphasizing the if here, if it is given in the right dose. So if you give enough zinc, you can absolutely bind up that sporidesmin toxin and stop that reaction from occurring. So there you don't get those free radicals. It absolutely works. But the problem that we have is that the vast majority of farmers do not give enough zinc. And this is not purposeful. This just happens. It's, for example, like when you've got 60% of the country giving it by the water, it is almost impossible to get cows to drink enough water to get their zinc up high enough to protect against eczema. And then, you just have little changes. You have a puddle, so the cows drink from a puddle, or you have water leaks, or you have evaporation from lots of troughs, or, you have a cloudy day, and then they don't drink as much, and then you've got bossy cows, and that won't let the others have the water. There are so many things that get involved in these management systems. So as a rule of thumb, I normally say, if you have control over what's going down the throat of a cow, generally speaking, it's a better method for control of facial eczema. If you don't have control of what's going on, so we're talking water and feed, they can work, but you've got to be very, very careful and monitor it closely to make sure you know what's going on.
So there are definitely some challenges in the application of the use of zinc. What are the other things that dairy farmers can be doing longer term to protect their herd from FE?
Again, when I present about this, I always say the first thing that farmers need to do is look into breeding. And this is where you guys are going to go next in a minute, because breeding is, I'm absolutely for it. It's just a little bit beyond my expertise, right? So breeding's number one. And the reason is because if zinc one day gets cut, and I've spoken to farmers like, no, zinc will never get stopped. They'll always keep bringing it in. I'm like, don't be so sure about that, because it's already being regulated over in the UK, I think. And one day something's going to happen that someone's going to decide to cut it. So we need to be prepared for that with longer term measures. So breeding is a longer term measure that you got to get onto, right? So that's number one, but I won't talk any more about that. There's other things you can do. You can use fungicides to spray onto the pasture. If you're using supplementary feeds, or you're using chicory or plantain or things like that, they're not eating as many spores. So those sorts of pasture management type options can help as well.
So just going back to the genetics component for managing facial eczema, Phil, could you tell us a bit more about the work that CRV has been doing with regards to breeding facial eczema tolerant sires?
Yeah, very happy to talk about this, Mitchell. As you know, it's a favourite topic of mine, or it's a bad topic, but it's a favourite interest. So CRV's been involved in testing bulls for facial eczema tolerance for the last 10 years. And if we go back 10 years, we kicked off the program in conjunction with people from Ag Research in particular the late Chris Morris, Neil Cullen and Neville Amies. And we've continued that relationship with the program for the last 10 years. And basically what we do is mimic what a lot of the sheep breeders have done for well on 30 years. We take our bulls through our progeny test program and challenge them with the sporidesmin toxin that Emma has previously mentioned. That challenge is done under very strict conditions, strict animal ethics protocols, and we monitor the bulls really closely. They're housed throughout the procedure. So the bulls are challenged, they get a challenge of the sporidesmin, and then every week we take blood samples and monitor the GGT level of those bulls. And the end point, if you like, is the GGT level at 21 days post-dosing. And those GGT values, we work with the database that Neil Cullen and the group at AgResearch have got. Those GGT levels for the bulls are put into that database, and through a statistical process, we estimate the breeding values of the bulls for GGT. We're interested in marketing those bulls that have breeding values that are low for GGT, because they're the bulls that have reacted least to the challenge.
So with CRV having facial eczema tolerant size in the market, how many farmers are using facial eczema tolerant size as part of their breeding program, and what results have you seen from farmers using these genetics?
So it's probably fair to say a lot of farmers have dabbled with the odd bull that is in this tolerant team. But there are a number of farmers that have committed fully to genetics to mitigate the facial eczema problems that they face. So these farmers, year upon year, use only bulls that are facial eczema tolerant. So year upon year, they're breeding offspring from these bulls that are becoming more and more tolerant to facial eczema. So if I could digress back to the sheep example for a minute here, some of the commercial sheep farmers have similarly committed fully to facial eczema tolerant rams over a period of 30 years. And we now know that over that 30 years, these breeders are having to increase the dose rate of sporidesmin to get a reaction. In other words, over 30 years, their ram flocks or their breeding flocks have become much more tolerant than they were 30 years ago to a dose of sporidesmin. And in fact, the sporidesmin dose is up to 7 times as much now to get a measurable response in those flocks. With our bull breeding, we're only 10 years down the track, but with the very strict animal ethics protocols, we haven't increased the dose. But what we're seeing in these herds whose farmers have been using these sires, we see anecdotal evidence that these groups of younger cows are not having the same incidence of clinical signs as the older unbred groups of cows. It's something that's really hard to get a real accurate measurement on, but we have this anecdotal stories from farmers using these bulls that they are getting good responses.
And I think, as your sheep example shows, the power of genetics and the benefit of it as well compared to some of the other management options is that you only have to think about it once a year when you're choosing your bull team, and then the effects are permanent, which is nice.
Correct. The big thing is to get that genetic coverage, shall we say, it requires total commitment year upon year to these teams of bulls. And as Emma says, genetics is a slow process, but it gives us cumulative and long-lasting gains that hopefully are additive to things like zinc and fungicide treatment.
So with CRV being involved with this work regarding the genetics around facial eczema for the past 10 years, where is the research and development work heading for CRV in the future? And how is CRV planning to continue to help our dairy farmers breed more resilient, productive cows in the future?
Well, with regard to facial eczema, CRV is committed in the long term to providing bulls that have a degree of tolerance to facial eczema. We would like to move away from challenging bulls in the current system because it's expensive and there's a degree of risk, but it is a very effective way of challenging bulls and, if you like, of getting data. The alternative, seems to me, would be going to herds of cows, and particularly sire-proving herds that have used our sires, and to do GGT levels on those groups of 2-year-olds or even younger groups of calves. As Emma says, the issue then becomes, from year to year, we have different challenges for herds. So in some years, facial eczema may not be a major issue across main areas of New Zealand, and we'd lose data from those years simply because those groups of animals aren't challenged naturally. So ideally, be lovely, we could go in and take blood samples, measure the GGT in those groups of heifers or 2-year-olds, then do a genetic analysis to see which groups of daughters have been least affected and which sires, therefore, are more tolerant.
So some very exciting challenges, I guess, in the future to further progress with the facial eczema tolerant genetics.
We should also mention in that the role of genomics in the future is going to be important. So once we build up enough information on facial eczema and the markers of facial eczema, that will give us some advance in our breeding programs.
And that relies on the data collection, more data collection. Is that correct?
It relies, as Emma's referred to, hundreds of thousands of GGT samples being taken to build our reference.
So just looking at the bigger picture, our dairy industry's pasture-based system is one of our biggest competitive advantages here in New Zealand. So what challenges and opportunities do we face as we manage facial eczema in the future? And I'll open that up to both of you.
From my point of view, the challenges are numerous. We've got climate change and warming. So if anything, with pasture-based farming systems, we're going to have more exposure to facial eczema. The public perception of these sort of things is going to become more and more intense. So from a public point of view, it is absolutely imperative that farmers take steps to reduce and eliminate the impact of facial eczema. I think, personally, from our market's point of view, we take a big risk relying exclusively on zinc. That's, into the future, really risky. And I think from the animal and human welfare point of view, because it's terrible disease for animals, but I know that farmers whose animals are badly affected are almost equally affected. So there's numerous reasons why we have to really get on top of this disease.
Those are great points, Phil.
Yeah, I agree. I think you've summed that up beautifully. That's exactly the points that I would have said as well.
Perfect. Is there anything else anyone wanted to add?
Yeah, I want to just about go back to Emma's first point she made about farming becoming more and more complex. And there's absolutely no doubt about that. To me, facial eczema is one of a number of relatively new issues. And facial eczema isn't new, but its importance is becoming more important. So things like coldness and environmental traits are relatively again, not new, but becoming more and more important on the farming radar. And to a degree, they're similar to facial eczema in terms of the public perception of these sort of things that farmers have to take note of, and it just makes it all more difficult. It's no longer a case of growing as much grass and measuring out the size of the break each day. There's a hell of a lot of complicated stuff in the farming.
Thanks for joining me today, Emma and Phil. I think we can all agree that facial eczema presents a significant threat to our pastoral farming systems here in New Zealand. The potential impacts for animal health, milk production and public perception are very real. We talked about the need to do more to combat this disease, including more regular testing on farm. If we can take our lead from overseas, finding an alternative to zinc is really important. You highlighted some other key tools we can use to manage it, including on-farm management and genetics. CRV's work to help farmers tackle facial eczema is ongoing. Phil, it was great to hear about the genetics gains CRV's farmers are achieving, investing in facial eczema-tolerant genetics year upon year. If you'd like to learn more about how genetics can combat facial eczema, visit crvforall.co.nz or contact your nearest CRV field consultant.
Thanks for listening to CRV's Better Heard podcast. Read more about today's topic and our panel guests by visiting crvforall.co.nz. That's crv4all.co.nz. Or follow us on social media.